perhaps in the Indo-Pacific context. It's a
that Mr. Baker made a mistake in making that promise, or the U.S. government doesn't consider that a promise broken, or at least that understands why the Russians would be responding
This
this
has
way?
been long-standing policy of the United States, going back administrations. It's been long-standing policy of NATO for years now, going back and most acutely reflected in Bucharest. So this is not a new pronouncement we have put out. I want to also be clear about one other thing. NATO is a defensive alliance. It is defensive in nature. It's defensive in orientation. The idea that NATO or an aspirant country like Ukraine could pose a threat to Russia. I think as Secretary Blinken said last week, it would be laughable were the situation not so serious. So again, we have heard some of the same chatter from Moscow, chatter that to us sounds awfully pretextual, sounds an awful lot like what we might have and what we did in fact hear in 2014 in advance of Russia's previous military incursion into Ukraine. We know this is part of the Russian playbook, and we know it because we've seen it before. We know it because we've heard it before. We also know it because we're detecting it. As the Secretary said last week, we have seen social media postings with disinformation and misinformation increase by more than tenfold in recent weeks. And again, our concern, and this is reflected, and I think your question and some of what we're hearing emanate from Russia, is that there will be an attempt to fabricate some sort of pretextual justification for Russia and Russian forces to do what perhaps has been intended all along. So right now, we believe that there's a window of opportunity for us to engage diplomatically, as we've done with our NATO allies, to engage diplomatically with our Ukrainian partners, but also to engage diplomatically with the Russians. And we've done this already at senior levels. Of course, we've already engaged President Putin on this. President Biden will speak to him tomorrow. Secretary Blinken last week spoke to Foreign Minister Lavrov as well.
But, hold on a second. I think that what Barbara's making the point about James Baker's comment about not one word is not necessarily Ukraine in the future, but the fact that NATO has already expanded eastward after that promise was made. Poland, Czech Republic, Hungary, Baltic States. And you might say that NATO is a defensive alliance, but the Russians, you can believe them whether you want to or not, but they don't see it that way. And they look at what NATO operations in Serbia, NATO operations in Libya, and not saying as not being defensive in nature. So just to make that point, that it is not necessarily Ukraine that's here; it is the past. And then just the one thing that I hope you can answer is the Secretary speaking with President Zelensky today?
So on that, the Secretary, as I was walking out here, was on the phone with President Zelensky. He, as President Biden announced, is speaking to President Zelensky in the run-up to the conversation between the two presidents tomorrow.
I'm sorry, the President is speaking to President Zelensky?
Secretary Blinken is speaking to President Zelensky. Sorry if I misspoke.
No. I just wanted to make
the
sure.
President said this morning that Secretary Blinken would be speaking to
All right. Sorry, I didn't know.
President Zelensky. But let me make one other point about your point in your question, Barbara and Matt. We are supportive of increased transparency, of dialogue between Russia and NATO. If there is misunderstanding about what NATO is, what NATO seeks to do, what NATO is doing, we certainly support engagement, we support dialogue, we support transparency, because we don't want there to be any ambiguity about what this alliance stands for and what this alliance is resolutely opposed to. So if that would be a means by which to increase some level of trust and confidence between Moscow and NATO, we would be in support of that. Tomorrow, that's precisely why President Biden will be engaging President Putin, because we believe there's no substitute for leader-level engagement. high-level engagement, the kind of engagement that you've seen between the Secretary and Foreign Minister Lavrov, that you saw between President Putin and President Biden in June in Switzerland, and what you'll see tomorrow as well. Said.
Thank you.
In all fairness, NATO has not always been defensive, as Matt pointed out, in Serbia and Libya and other places. Anyway.
In all fairness, NATO has never been offensive towards Russia.
What do you call
NATO,
what do you call their interference in Libya? What do you call what they did in
I
Libya?
think Libya and Russia are, and we can
No, I'm
we
just
can have a
saying
separate
that-
conversation
no,
about
that's a different conversation.
the
I
NATO
agree.
mission in Libya. But to call to say that Russia and Libya are synonymous, I'm not sure that is something that, in fact, I'm quite confident that's something that this department would not
Okay,
subscribe
all right.
to.
Let me move